Hello folks, welcome back. Professor Bannock here to talk to you about Hobbes and his conception of the human being and as a result his conception of ethics. Now Hobbes represents a substantial departure from many of the traditions of philosophy which see ethics as something natural, part of human nature, perhaps part of the natural world. Hobbes is going to say that ethics is an external constraint imposed on human beings in order to maintain order, that it is artificial, unnatural, that it takes human beings out of the state of nature. That's when we get things like civilizations, what Hobbes calls the commonwealth, societies, governments, and so on and so forth. All of these are artificial constraints. They do not express what's inside the human being. Rather, they put the human being into a totally new form of existence. Hobbes' metaphysical framework is one of materialism. This is the idea that all that exists is nothing over and above matter in motion. And this includes human beings. So human beings don't have some special immaterial soul or any kind of immaterial existence. The idea of materialism stretches all the way back to the ancient world. And Hobbes is an example of an early modern thinker who takes materialism up. Now, unlike other lifeless forms of matter, human beings have some kind of will or some kind of faculty of choice. So Hobbes needs to account for the faculty of choice or the will in terms of materialism. So to account for the will or the faculty of choice that seems to be in humans and not in rocks or in leaves and trees and water, Hobbes distinguishes between voluntary motion and involuntary motion. All living beings have involuntary motion involved with them. For example, the coursing of blood through your veins is an involuntary motion. It goes towards your being, it keeps you alive, but it's not something that you control. And something similar can be said about many of the functions of the nervous system and of our metabolic processes in general. All of that stuff going on involuntarily, you don't have much say in it. Now, voluntary motion, on the other hand, is the things we choose to do, the motions we choose to make. But all of our choices are going to be essentially motions in two different senses. First, it's going to be a motion of matter that we choose to carry out. For example, I choose to write on the whiteboard. That's a movement that I can make with my body. It's a motion. The second sense in which the faculty of choice is a motion is that, so Hobbes here has a very deflationary understanding of voluntary motion. Voluntary motions are determined in accordance with representations of our imagination. So we can think of it like this. If I choose to write on the whiteboard, that motion has its start with me imagining what it would be like to write on the whiteboard and then moving to carry that imagination out into reality. So nothing like Kant's pure practical reason is going on here. Even something weaker like Aristotle's practical reason isn't really operative here. It's merely that we have imaginations and then we can kind of make our movements a lot like what we imagined was going to happen. Now, tracing this back even further, I become motivated to do some voluntary action, and even that motivation, which Hobbes calls endeavor, is small motions somewhere in my body. They aren't perceivable. You can perceive my motion of writing on the whiteboard, but you can't perceive my choice to do that. Still, Hobbes is going to call these small motions that precipitate or predelineate the larger, more observable motions that come about from them. So the will for Hobbes is a purely material thing. It involves different systems of motion than involuntary motions, but they're all motions just the same. They just have a different kind of structure to them. As a result, even the voluntary motions are subject to causal determinism. All motion is, for Hobbes, mechanical. It's one thing pushing against the other thing. And therefore, the one thing causes the next thing into motion. So even our voluntary motions, they have this structure where it involves our imagination, it involves our emotions, it involves our desires. More on that momentarily. Even those involuntary motions are ultimately involved in the closed causal deterministic system of material. There's no will from the outside that comes in. It's simply more motion, more determined motion. So we're starting to build up the sense in which, if Hobbes is right, many of the previous thinkers that you might have looked at in ethics are wrong. Kant, for example, being a big point of contrast here, where for Kant, our choices genuinely overdetermine the material reality. They genuinely come from outside of that closed causal system. They are causes that are not constituted by mere matter in motion. This leads Hobbes to a conception of ethics and morality and of the good that we can call a moral subjectivism or a moral relativism. The will is a way of moving towards things or moving away from things. As Hobbes says, our will, our endeavor to choose, is the small beginnings of motion in the body. We just went over that. There's no immaterial will. It's just the body starting to cook up its movements until finally we can see the bigger movements that are the expression of that choice. When these motions are aimed towards something, we call that desire. And similarly, when we get something that we aim towards, we call that love. When these motions are aimed away from something, we call that aversion. So when we want something, we move towards it. When we don't like something, when we are averse to it, we move away from it. And that's determined by, again, matter and motion. The feeling of pleasure that we get when we get something that we are aimed towards, the feeling of pain that we anticipate, that we imagine is going to accompany something that we don't like, we try to move away from it. All just more matter and motion. And so, on this view, good and evil are going to reduce down to these kinds of matter and motion. The good is simply that which we desire. The evil is simply that to which we are averse. Now, we're in the habit of applying these predicates, good and evil, to the objects, but they really just denote our attitude toward that object. The things that we like, which we desire, which we move towards, we call that good. The things which we don't like, to which we are averse, the things we move away from, we call that evil. But these are not properties of the object. This pen has a lot of properties. It has a cylindrical shape. It has a white and black color. It has practical use of writing on the whiteboard. Those are all properties or predicates of this object. Now, if I try to go in and say this pen is good, I've now made a mistake because I'm applying the property good to the pen, when really the property goodness is just something about how I move away or towards, in this case, towards the pen. I move towards it. I want to use it. Contrast that with this pen, which is sort of out of ink. I move away from that. I don't want that pen. I move towards this one. The pen, I then think, is good, or in the other case, bad or evil. But really, it's nothing more than me moving towards or moving away from the pen. And the result is a subjectivism or a relativism, because different people will move towards different things, different cultures will move towards different things, and different people will move away from different things, different cultures will move away from different things. There's no standard within nature to call things good or bad, good or evil, moral or immoral. There are just patterns of motion. Now, Hobbes' conception of the human being as matter in motion leads him towards a certain view about human nature, and that will lead him to a certain view about what our institutions can and must do in order to keep civil society afloat. This is the state of nature thought experiment. We are asked to imagine a hypothetical past in which humans existed, much as they do now, but in the absence of all of our civil institutions, all of our governments, all of our laws, schools, all of those things that form our society, those are taken away. Human beings in a state of nature. Now, this is a hypothetical thought experiment. It's an exercise in speculative history. We're not being asked to do any empirical work and try to find the primordial state of man as it actually occurred in Paleolithic times or anything like that. We're simply asked to try to imagine this scenario in order to do some conceptual work, not some historical work. And the conceptual work is to separate out the natural from the artificial elements of human psychology. What would human mind be like if it had no influence of the social institutions, of the Commonwealth, and so on and so forth. For example, we can ask whether the warlike elements of our psychology are natural or artificial. And here's where a famous split occurs between Jean-Jacques Rousseau on one hand and Thomas Hobbes on the other hand. Each of them carries out the state of nature thought experiment. Rousseau uses this to argue that the warlike elements of our psychology are socially constructed. They're actually put in place by our civil institutions. Hobbes arguing the opposite, that it's our civil institutions that keep a check on the natural warlike psychology of the human being. In a state of nature, we all share the same space, and that space will include certain resources. These are things that our human beings are drawn towards, things that we desire, and individuals will either be able to share in that resource or not if the resource is limited or for some other reason. So each of the individuals moves towards the resource, but let's say in this case, it's a finite resource, only one person can get it. Well, then there's going to be conflict between the individuals competing for the resource. Now, if I'm involved in this conflict with another individual or another group, in a state of nature, I'm justified in doing whatever I need to preserve my own life, even if that means taking the life of the other person. So each of us in the state of nature, Hobbes reasons, is justified to do whatever we need to do in the name of self-preservation. So Hobbes reasons that the only real natural right, the only entitlement we have, I'm not entitled to this resource because someone else could take it. I'm not entitled to my property because someone else could come up and take it. The only thing I am entitled to is to do everything I need to preserve my life. So Hobbes reasons that the only natural right, the only entitlement that exists in nature prior to our institutions is the right to self-preservation, the right to life. As a result, in the state of nature, there's no moral standard. Human beings have the entitlement to do whatever it is they feel necessary for their self-preservation, because no moral or legal obligations could exist in the absence of the establishment of a commonwealth. The orderly coexistence of all the individuals competing for resources for Hobbes requires a top-down principle of strength. That is to say, a ruler, a leader who will impose law, who will impose punishments, and who will impose a standard of legal and moral justification. Now, in such a state of nature, my self-preservation is under constant threat. So if I reason about what's best to do in order to obtain my goals being to stay alive and get the resources that I need, it's going to be rational for me to choose to accept the power of something outside of me that will help me stay alive. The result is that one's social, legal, and moral rights and obligations are grounded in a contract or an agreement that we make in order to obtain an orderly, stable, and secure society. As a result, the central good in Hobbes' social contract theory, we can't think of this as the good, but the central good that is proportioned by our social contract is the good of security. So rather than morality being a denial of self-interest, as in Kant, morality is a constraint we impose on ourselves in order to further our self-interest. The result is a kind of moral conventionalism. Again, that morals are not the result or the expression of human nature, but a convention that we place upon ourselves in order to obtain security. No moral or legal standard could exist outside the establishment of a commonwealth, so all moral and legal standards are relative to the laws of a commonwealth, and those laws are legitimate to the extent that they preserve our security. We give up our total freedom in the state of nature in exchange for security. Moral obligations are binding because otherwise we'd forfeit our claim to that security.